Hey y'all, welcome back to Road Trotting. Today you are going to see part 3 of our 3-part series on sex and sexuality in Denmark versus the United States.
Yeah, and in today's video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into attitudes around sex and sexuality. We'll learn about how they've changed over time. We'll talk about some specific topics like taboos and public displays of affection, and also see if there's any implications and repercussions from the different types of sexuality societies in the two different countries.
Yeah, and if you missed the first 2 installments, you can catch those links in the description below, and we'll also put them on the end screen, so make sure that you watch them if you missed the first 2. And if that's the case, then you may not know that we got a little help for this entire series with some experts over at Copenhagen University. So in their interviews, they told us all about the topics of sex and sexuality in America versus Denmark. So let's get right to it and see what they taught us.
Hi, my name is Jenna Strizzi. I'm a PhD in Psychology of Sexuality from the University of Almeria in Spain, and I'm also a Master of Sexology from the same university. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I've been dedicated to the scientific study of sexuality since 2006.
I am Camilla Uvrup, and I am originally a Dane, but moved to the US and lived there for 13 years. During that time, I received my PhD in social psychology from the University of Houston with a focus on intimate relationships. I am a postdoc here at Copenhagen University and study sexuality and romantic relationships.
Now, the first topic we want to get into is understanding a little bit of the history of sex and sexuality. How have attitudes changed over time in the two different countries? And we learned a little bit of this when we did an earlier video talking about the history of homosexuality in Denmark at the National Museum, and we certainly learned about it in the history books as well.
Yeah, so it was really cool to have that conversation again, and as it wrapped up, I wanted to learn a little bit more about taboos. Like, what is taboo? Since homosexuality at one time was, what's currently not something that's okay to talk about or explore or experiment with in polite company in Denmark or the US?
Every generation tends to think that we invented sex,
Yeah, right.
That we're pioneering, that we're so much more progressive than our parents and grandparents. And in the 1920s, this was the roaring 20s. So 100 years ago, there were some movements that were quite progressive towards and attitudes towards sexuality, and it tends to go a bit pendular throughout history. In 1929 in Denmark is when they changed the law for gender affirmation. So now there's such strong advocacy and work for trans rights, and that's, and 100 years ago there were laws being changed and made for trans rights. The first sex researchers started in the late 1800s, and there's and up through the 1920s, through the 1930s in Europe, there's quite a lot of really important sex research that was happening in Europe. Then the Second World War happened, and lots of censorship, and lots of books were burned and studies were burned. But that was a time when there was scholarship, really important scholarship happening in Europe, and fighting, and there were movements for gay rights, and changing laws that are not dissimilar to what's happening 100 years later. So we stand on the shoulders of previous generations. Like, queer people have always existed, and there's always been resistance, and people have always been fighting for human rights.
Wow.
Then we saw the gay liberation movement, Stonewall, and hippie free love. These movements changed both Denmark and the United States, in the world, in radical ways that, and changed the way that we all view and think about sex and gender, and the women's rights movement, of course. And through the 1960s and 70s, we saw an explosion of the discourses about sexual rights and human rights and rights about sexuality and gender, and that then in the 80s we see a pushback, partially with political movements, of more conservative political movements, but then also HIV/AIDS changed sex.
Sure.
It changed, and free love how we engage in sexuality and think about sexuality. So, and we're still recovering from that.
Now, I don't know the year in the U.S., but something that I think is interesting is homosexuality was decriminalized in Denmark in the 30s, which kind of fits with the timeline of transgender rights in Denmark. But if you look at homosexuality was a psychiatric diagnosis for many years, both in the DSM, the prevailing manual for psychiatric or psychological diagnoses in the U.S. In the DSM, it was removed in the 70s, but in Denmark it wasn't removed until about 81.
Wow.
And so I find that interesting that there's actually a little bit of a lag in Denmark with respect to that it took longer to remove homosexuality as a diagnosis in Denmark. Also interestingly, in 89 was registered partnerships made legal in Denmark.
Yeah.
So while it took a long time to remove homosexuality as a clinical diagnosis, they allowed gay marriage in its original form very early.
And they were the first country.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are surprised when we share with our friends that in the U.S. that Denmark had the first gay marriage at Copenhagen City Hall in 1989. And so we've talked about a lot, especially with cultural attitudes towards sex and sexuality. But what are some things in Denmark and in the U.S. that may be considered taboo? I know both countries have different attitudes, specifically around gender identity and anybody on the sexuality spectrum as well. What about non-monogamy, open relationships and marriages, any kind of pansexuality, things like that? What are some things that public sex, some things that may be taboo or have shifted attitudes over time?
My perception is, and I admit it's a perception, is that even Danes don't really talk about non-monogamy or open relationships or public sex or a lot of the things that we might consider to be taboo topics.
So it's still a bit taboo, those things that we may think of as areas we don't talk about or go into. In Denmark as well.
I do perceive them as much more accepted because there are quite a few swinging clubs here in Copenhagen, and attitudes towards consensual non-monogamy are a bit more positive. I think both cultures' attitudes towards non-consensual non-monogamy, so cheating without a non-open relationship, is not well seen in either culture.
Wow, a lot of really cool conversation, and I definitely learned quite a few things. Some things I knew about from living in Copenhagen for a little while, but it was really cool to kind of see how it all related and contrasted to life in the U.S.
Yeah, and obviously we feel those taboos all the time growing up in the U.S., so nice to hear that contrast that we have here. I think a different thing that's got a contrast too is going to be how people express affection. I think public displays of affection are very different in different cultures, and we certainly see them differently between Denmark and the U.S.
Yeah, so that was one conversation that we went into during this interview, so let's roll the tape and see what we learned.
Denmark is PDA, public displays of affection.
Sure.
Very common in Denmark.
Yeah.
Whether it be simply holding hands or kissing in public, you will see public displays of affection, hugging. But you may not necessarily see this in the US, and even dating partners may feel quite uncomfortable showing affection in these ways. Okay. Holding hands, kissing. For some people, it's a no-go. It's a huge taboo in the US.
Yeah. I've noticed that too, and this is purely anecdotal as well, but I find that even affection between parent and child, and that is more common, I think, even in Denmark. So yes. I do think that I noticed that Danish parents are more affectionate. It's
much more expected too that you have these positive feelings and show these feelings in a public space. Yeah.
Yeah, that is one really nice part of being here. It's very refreshing to see how affectionate people are. But I also wanted to know if there were any repercussions with that that may come along with such an affectionate society and such an open and progressive society. Is there anything that maybe could be a pitfall with that? So let's see what they said.
Actually, interestingly, when pornography was legalized in Denmark, the United States government took interest in this. And just to make sure that I say this correctly. So the United States Congress funded the President's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography, was set up by President Lyndon B. Johnson to study pornography. And they believed that the hypothesis was that if we legalize pornography, there's going to be an increase in sexual crimes and sex crimes. And so they did a study on this and found that actually there was no increase in sex crimes due to the legalization of pornography. And there's no association with that. And one important caveat, a topic that we should also mention in relation to this is the Nordic Paradox. So this is the phenomenon that you can find higher rates of reported sexual violence and intimate partner violence, specifically intimate partner violence and including sexual violence with an intimate partner in Nordic countries. So that there's this relationship with higher levels of gender equality, but corresponding with higher levels of violence. So this is a paradox, right?
Sure.
And so more recent scholarship has found that this is more of just a methodology issue, that people are maybe more open to reporting. Reported prevalence of sexual violence or violence isn't the same as actual incidence, the actual number. And there's another hypothesis that where people, where there's higher levels of gender equality, people can leave abusive relationships.
Right.
So there's the same perhaps percentage, that the hypothesis now is that there's perhaps the same percentage of people who are violent partners, but they're violent to more people because people can get out of those violent relationships. And so that may be why we're seeing this higher number of people reporting in studies.
Interesting.
Some research suggests that there is an association between being more open in terms of sexuality and sex and perceptions of reduced risk of victimization. So meaning that if you are more open, you also perceive that you're less likely to be the victim of sexual crimes. And some research then speculates that could lead to more risky sexual behaviors that might actually make you become a victim, like could lead to victimization. Now, whether that's true, probably more research is needed, but so there's these flip sides to openness. It's not necessarily associated with more actual crimes, but it could predispose people potentially.
Okay.
One of the consequences of increased openness is, if we look at it from the sexual minority stress theory, is that people who are sexual minorities in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity when they live in the evidence is quite strong that when you live in a society that's more open to sexual diversity, that this has important impacts on health. That living if we live in a society or an environment that's openly hostile to our sexual orientation or to our gender identity, this increases level of stress or real or perceived risk of stigma events or a true increased risk of violence and hate crimes. And that has important impacts on health in terms of stress. And so when we live in societies that are more open and accepting, this has important health impacts for sexual minority populations, and again, can be linked to decrease in suicide attempts and ideation and true attempts. So that's a very positive outcome of openness to sexuality and to sexual diversity.
Yeah. So progress really does save lives.
Yeah. It does. There was a study that was done in the United States looking at the environment that in which people live and how that impacts health. There's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. So,
Yeah.
It's a big effect.
Yeah.
I'd never actually heard about the Nordic Paradox in that way. It was really interesting to hear that and wonder if it's a manifestation of just difference in reporting or if it's something that actually has a higher incidence in reality. Really interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely obviously other factors that come into play with something like that in those statistics. So it was interesting to learn more about something that I only knew a brief bit about.
And the other part I found super interesting was the idea that in open societies, that people who are sexual minorities can have a 10-year longer life expectancy just based on mental health. I mean, I think both of us can speak to the mentally taxing part of being something that maybe isn't as welcome in society to the extent that we have been in growing up gay. But I just think being able to put it in stark terms like that shows the value of what pride brings, and the fact that being willing to have a society that is welcoming to people of all sexual orientations and genders is not only something that's good, but it's something that helps keep people alive. It's incredible to hear.
Yeah, that's why when somebody says, why do we celebrate pride? Why do we need pride?
That's why. That's why.
Yeah. So thank you so much to Jen and Camilla for providing that and helping us out through this entire series. It was fantastic. Thank you all for watching and for being along on this with us. Again, if you didn't catch the first 2 segments, we'll put them on the end screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done that already, and hit the bell for notifications so you can be informed every time we drop a new video. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Hi.